Hi, it's Ileana at Awakening Cosmic Reality Show, and I have Daniel Sala with me. And today we are doing part 2 for the Radu Cinamar Transylvania series. We're going to be covering books 4, 5, and 6. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks. Yeah, I figured we should cover these as well because they are the heaviest and the most impactful, and the rest were just really a nice lead into it. And yeah, it never ceases to amaze me that all of these things that we hear about in the SSP are actually a stone's throw away from us, not just in space, but on Earth, and not just on Earth, but in my case, in my own country. So, but this one extends much further than that, this section of the books, I should say. And yeah, the fourth one, which is where we left off, is not really that applicable for a podcast because the first 2/3 don't really have much action, but still, I should briefly mention them because, after all, it's titled after this theme, which is the secret parchments that I mentioned in book 2. And he finally gets to transcribe them. And on their own, they won't make too much of an impact. However, if you read the book and the lead into them, it's all about that, the dialogue, because that's the reason why he had a couple of characters interpret them for him. So I'm just gonna read them in a minute, but don't expect to, blow you away. But the book actually starts with Department Zero and how it was on very shaky ground at the beginning because uh, they had one of these special discoveries in the Orostia Mountains. And it turns out that it's almost on the level of the Buchech connection, of the Buchech complex. Not quite, but very nearly. And it was considered by their so-called enemies for the Freemasonry and other influences that they were withholding information, even though they really weren't. But they were in a pickle there, and they had to, the general that was the head of Department Zero had to resign. And luckily, Radu Cinamar went to the US by their invitation to learn the practice of remote viewing, which they sometimes offer just to elite people. And they submitted Radu because they wanted to elevate him. And so he went there and he performed very well. And I'm not going to cover his adventures there. It's kind of inside baseball, but he does learn remote viewing and mentions how it's a really effective practice that defies time and space, like you well know, and that we are probably going to confront ourselves much more in the future with. And then he manages to get an elevated position in Department Zero and eventually even get to visit the projection hall whenever he wants. That's in book 5, but he climbs the ranks very quickly, and he's third in command after Cesar and another guy. And next, aside from Dr. Shen, aka Repasundi, we have another character who doesn't age, apparently, a Malaysian woman. She's called Shin Lee, and she is introduced to him. Apparently, she was behind the scenes in Department Zero as far back as the 80s, but we only learn about her now. And she was of a statuesque beauty, but she also had wisdom to match it. And she was the counterpart to Dr. Shen to help Radu and therefore us understand what those parchments really entailed. So I'm just gonna cover them quickly. So the first of the 5 is compassion and how there's a divine source of it in the universe, and we need to recognize and link to it. And this, another name for it is love, and it governs all the world and it's infinite. And the second one is that all that we are is just a result of our thoughts, and what you think is what you get. And this also goes hand in hand with what the Andromedans say, for example, that the lesson of the reincarnation cycle is actually that you project your own reality, and that you're much more powerful than you think. The third is synchronicity and how there are no coincidences. And when events or experiences coincide, seem like they're outside the bounds of probability, it's just a failure to interpret them correctly, and there's always an intention behind it. And that actually is, in a way, a proof of God. And they happen much more frequently than we give it credit. They happen all the time. So the fourth is vibration and how we're all connected by it, and that nothing is ever static. And the fifth is to align yourself with your own higher will and the divine source of creation. And this is my first question for you, is I think you frequently communicate with your higher self, and do you find that it's fruitful?
Yeah, I communicate with two of my higher selves, Janaea and Miara. So they are Andromedan and Pleiadian. They bring a unique perspective that they see things beyond linear time. They see everything all at once. So they can tell me future events, like near future and future that's yet to happen. And they also sort of navigate me through that to find the best path of what's to come. And I can see the positive and negative of what's to come, and I can sort of circumvent the negative if I want, unless there's something very specific for me to learn, a lesson from that stuff. I can sort of navigate around it instead of going through it, which is, it's a hard thing when you're experiencing a negative polarity of an experience. So they sort of teach me how to circumvent it, go around it, not through it, or totally avoid it if possible. By looking at all the possibilities from this event of what could be the outcome, they show me the outcomes, and to choose the best timeline event. So to change the polarity from negative to positive as much as I can. And you can do that with your mind. You can time travel with your mind, because you're projecting yourself into that future. You're seeing what's yet to happen, and you can change that, navigate through it, around it, and basically create a different outcome than what was originally supposed to happen, if that is for your highest good. So this is what I do with Janaea and Miara a lot. I would say they're like my advisors. They're the highest source of my higher selves, the best energy of my higher selves, because they're beyond this dimension. They're in the other higher dimensions. So they're not encumbered by ego. They're not encumbered by human life issues. They're not encumbered by anything going on this planet. So they can give a different perspective on what's happening than what I have. And once they show me things, we talk about positivity and good polarity and how to figure this out. Then I examine everything that they show me and teach me. And I decide, is this for my highest good? Should I make a change in what I saw in the future? Or should I leave it alone? What am I supposed to learn from this? How am I supposed to go through this or around this? So it's the responsibility is on me to select what is for my highest good from what they show me and teach me. They don't just tell me what to do, they only guide me. So it's about free will, human perspective to make a final choice or choices after confirming with the higher selves, because they're not the ones making the decision. They can only guide and give their perspective to help me make my choices later on, if I so choose to make these choices. I don't have to listen to what they say. I don't have to do what they kindly suggest or, show me. I just have to take in all the perspectives from them, me, and then look at everything together and make a choice if I want to. If I don't, I can just not make a choice and things will be the same as what they showed me, and it'll happen that way for a reason. So I think it's very intricate connecting with the higher selves, and there's a lot of higher knowing how to navigate through this stuff and how to navigate through energy and time and space, because up there it's not linear. Here it's a bit more linear. We time everything so well. It's all timed by clocks and stuff. It's kind of regimented. To them, it's not regimented. It's just fluidic time flowing. And you can change that time if you want, or you can let it just flow and reveal itself as it should. But you can change it with your mind anytime. You're not restricted to just linear time. That's what they also taught me.
Yeah, that's true. And you brought up polarity, and Shin Lee also makes a point that it's true that 3D is necessarily stuck in polarity, but we have to also look at it from the higher celestial beings' point of view, which is that as long as it exists, even if it's bad, you can still somehow construe it as good if you see it from a bird's eye view, and it's advanced, and usually you can't do it. But also that evil, what we say is evil, it's essentially just our own ignorance, and the quicker we amend it, then the faster we can say that it's just as much a part of God's will, if you will, as good. So which ultimately are probably going to look at evil as natural as anything else. But as long as we're in this density, we're probably condemned to not do that. But anyway, the last third of the book really deals with this massive discovery in Orostia Mountains, and it starts with a certain program, because the reason why Department Zero was accused for withholding information is that this discovery was only sussed out in the early 90s, when they had, just after communism, a program started in Romania to uncover and research the lost cultures and languages of older Romanian peoples, and like the Dacians. And so they started this dig around the old capital of the Dacians called Sarmisegetuza. And a professor in archaeology was staying at this local family, and was using their son as just a helper in these digs, and he was the overseer, and he was always the last to leave. And so one night, while his helper was just testing out an axe about a few hundred meters away from this site, all of a sudden the professor hears a shout, and then quickly goes to investigate what the kid found. And so it turns out that while he hit the axe on a rock, it crumpled, and it revealed a 1.5 wide opening. And they both went in with flashlights, because it's in his blood. He's an archaeologist, and they were pretty disappointed that they didn't find anything of note, but until they saw a certain slit in a wall, and then he just on a whim had figured that might as well have the kid dig through it, and that led to another narrow passage, but they could easily go through it. And through that one, there was another small circular opening through which they heard a strange hum, and they persisted through that one as well, and ended up on nearly flat ground, which that was the point of no return, because it was nearly flat, as well as covered with gravel, which suggested some intelligence there. And so they went on, and it got wider and wider, and it was declined. And they eventually, about 500 meters in, found some stairs which were suspiciously flat and level. And they too were covered with the gravel, and they got to an even wider corridor, which they kept exploring even though it was late, because they figured it was also peaceful, the atmosphere. That's another thing. And when they got deeper, it got wider and taller, and he saw some glints in the ceiling, which he interpreted as basalt. And then they went on, and there was a bifurcation in the end, in the form of a semicircle, and they went through the bigger opening because it suggested more safety, and they were already risking it. And in that chamber, that was actually long, was 150 meters till the end, and about 20 to 30 meters wide. And at that point, because they were so close, because previous to that, it was so large that he couldn't even see the ends of the walls, only the ceiling. But in that room, he could clearly perceive that he was surrounded 360 degrees by gold. And usually in mines, you have to extract the ore and only then purify it till you get the gold. But in this case, there was a vein of about 15 meters or so that was jutting out from the wall, and all around it was just a cascade of gold. And there was no question that it was that, because he also had a pretty simple but still a good enough camera that had a flash, and he could take pictures of it. And not just that, but there was furniture, and it was also made out of gold, and it had flat edges, but it had a certain elegance. And there was a bed, and next to it there were inscriptions of a language he couldn't recognize, so we took a picture of it. And there were neatly aligned large chairs or thrones, 3 on each side of a huge table, or what he thought was a table, because it was really just parallelepiped, or an elongated box. But all of this was gold, and it was merged with the ground, and which also confounded him. And these thrones were 2-meter tall, and they also had rectangular inscriptions behind them, each one of them, and they also contained signs that he couldn't fathom. And he figured that those must have been particular to the priest or whatever person lay in those chairs or thrones. And at the end of the table, opposite to the entrance, was the largest throne, which is 3 meters tall. And behind it was a picture that also was made of gold, or 3D relief of gold, that symbolized the sun and its rays. And between that image and the largest throne was a portal that enveloped in its light, which was light blue, the whole room. They no longer even needed their flashlights. And this portal actually was on the ground. It was ellipse shaped and 2 meters long and 1.5 meters wide. And the kid jumped through this portal. He couldn't help himself. And the reason why the kid did that is that as soon as they approached the portal, which gave the architect dizziness because of what he saw, and he even fainted for a little bit. And what he saw was the universe, or a cosmos, and a planet that was about the size of the Earth as seen from the moon, except it was different colors. Instead of green, it was yellow and orange, but it also had a lot of blue. And the minute they approached it and looked through it, the portal, a wormhole quickly emerged from it and united with the portal in a matter of a few seconds, and it enveloped them in a white light. And that's when the reckless kid jumped in, and the second he did, the wormhole retracted at the same pace that it came up, and the archaeologist retreated, and at that point he fled the place. Then he has alerted the authorities, and 3 people from SRI, which is a special department in Romania, quickly came from Bucharest. And actually there were 4, but one of them also jumped in the portal, so only 3 emerged out. And it was so startling that when they got out, they covered the place so no one else would get in, and they also had hired policemen to guard the place, but only one other person, which was the driver of a cement truck, knew where it was, and he apparently went mad because he didn't respect their instructions to stay in the car, and he went in behind them, and he saw what lied behind. We never hear about him again. They came out with the intention to hide it, and they, using that cement truck themselves with the cement mixer, they covered the hole as well as with earth and vegetation, and did such a good job that no one found it again. And the reason why is that the three men went back to Bucharest the same day, which was the second day after the initial discovery, and they died in a car wreck. But it didn't seem premeditated because the dossier that documented all these things, including declarations from the archaeologist, was in the car with them. So, and it also was too quick for it to have been, planned. But eventually, this document made its way to Cesar because they were tasked with finding these anomalies and getting to the bottom of them. And he even got to talk to this professor just before he got taken and never seen again, just the very next day, the very next morning. But he got a few hours in with him, and he described these things. And in a secret document that Cesar showed to Radu, he could see the language, and apparently it's the original in the European language. And this they sent this to 3 independent and blind universities to attest to this. And one of them was so old that they couldn't even identify any part of it, but the others they did, and they figured out that the root words, all those peoples of the time spoke, they live on today. And he gives some examples, but essentially they're convinced that it's the oldest language, and the one that the other ones were just offshoots of. But that's natural as well, because your location determines what your language looks like. So, but not just the gold, which, by the way, I was going to mention that apparently gold is a conductor of a spirituality in any population.
Mhm.
And that when you have huge conglomeration like this, that it imprints on the population and lasts thousands of years, and that it's kind of a conductor of subtle energy, if you will. And I think you had many references to gold technology in your books, and maybe you can go into the importance of gold.
Yeah, so when I had been trying to open up the Akashic records, a path, like my soul path to the Akashic records, and look at my book of life and what was in there about Mars and Atlantis, I couldn't open the book. I was energetically circling it, and I'm like, what am I missing here? I hadn't been attuned enough yet to just energetically open my Akashic records. Not at that time. I was just starting to practice doing it with the path prayer. That's one way of entering the Akashic records, but it wasn't really working for me. So, and then I heard my intuitive voice, just my intuitive inner voice, say, well, go get that family heirloom ring. Go get it. And I'm like, why? It's gold. This is a massive ring. It's a men's ring. It's my dad's ring. It has the AK initials, my dad's first name, last name, my middle name is a fuller version of his name, except female. And so the initials even match me. So I got this ring, and it's made out of pure gold, like pure Russian gold. And that gold is the purest. And it has these columns. So it looks like ancient Greek, Sumerian, and it has these even how the initials are formed is very much goes back to the Atlantean times. And my dad's like, I don't know why my grandfather fashioned, like, because his father fashioned the ring, my grandfather. He's like, I don't know why my dad did this way. I'm like, it has certain significance because the columns, the energy, it just had that Sumerian, it had that Greek, that Atlantean feeling to it. So I put the ring on and I'm like, oh, I zoomed in to my Akashic records. I went inside the Akashic records and I was able to open my book of life and scroll through the pages. Because again, the gold is a frequency conductor to your soul energy. It sort of attunes you to your psychic abilities. It heightens ability, it allows you to see things beyond the 3D world. So that's what this gold ring did for me. To this day, I have this ring and it's in a safe. I now keep it in a safe because I would never sell it. I would never sell this ring. I don't care what it costs. I don't even know what it costs. Doesn't matter. To me, it's priceless. It's sacred because it opens up portal systems energetically, if you will. So that's what it was for me, but there's much more. Apparently, there are many different realms and there's many different places you can go above the 3D. And up there, there's chairs. One of them is a gold chair. And if you sit in it, right, if you find the golden chair and has the lion paws and all that, you can literally change the frequency of the world. You can literally shift space-time. You can wake up civilizations from the ones that are asleep. You can stop the solar flash event. You can change that. You can literally change things energetically if you sit in this chair or stand above it. And there's a silver one, there's a gold one, there's a blue one. And this is in the 9th dimension and above. It's all connected to frequency, right? It's all connected to the light keys, to the soul keys, to the fabric of energy. And it's beyond space-time, it's beyond physicality. So the fact that there was physical golden chairs made from gold, like thrones that you can sit in, I think they were activator technology to going to other realms and dimensions. So just because there was this portal system with your mind, you can sit in these chairs and go somewhere else and change things, or you can go through that portal to other planets. So this technology is literally designed for the mind to go elsewhere and for the mind to change things on a cosmic level by the gold amplification. Because when you're in the chair, you're sitting in the gold chair, it literally changes your frequency as well, and allows you to do things you otherwise wouldn't be able to humanly do with your mind and psychic abilities. It amplifies everything, and it allows you to see things beyond human perception. So I think that's what these golden chair technologies in that cavern system were doing. So if the archaeologist or the kid had sat in one of these golden chairs, they would have probably seen a lot of things, cosmology, history, or been able to do things or had their psychic ability activated if they sat in these throne chairs. Because again, gold is the amplifier, and gold can literally amplify your energy frequency, your soul frequency, to uptune it to a higher vibration and literally evolve you on the biological scale, molecular scale, activate your psionic abilities, activate your mind evolution, your soul evolution, your body. I think there's a lot of possibilities with what gold can do. Gold even powers ships. It is part of crystalline systems. So is silver, and so is bismuth and tungsten. It's been said that it's been found in these arc ships by Jean-Charles Moyen, the French-Canadian secret space program experiencer. He saw something the Nordics had taught me, and this was a female Nordic named Nayada on the Mars basis. She taught me that bismuth, gold, and silver are used as application components in powering up the crystalline ships to go beyond the speed of light, faster than the speed of light. So you don't need to track the solar system. It doesn't take 7 months. It only takes a couple of days to a week with this technology integrated into the ships now. So, and again, I consider gold to be part of crystalline matrix, and it can be integrated in that, and it's used by extraterrestrials, and they're trying to integrate this technology now into the planetary warp ships. However, when you have metal alloy and you're integrating such things, it takes time to figure out how to integrate gold facets and stuff like that into a ship. Plus, they're talking about making diamond batteries that last almost 28,000 years soon by 2023. It could power your cell phone, it can power any device. Diamond battery. So that's amazing. Crystals have the power, the potential and the power to power anything. They're generators. They're the piezoelectric frequency from crystals. It activates anything. You can touch the crystal to your phone and suddenly you have a bigger charge on your battery than say it was almost at 0. Now it's at 3 or 4% magically, because the crystal frequency basically gives an electric charge, a boost to a dead battery, and reactivates your device. So in Atlantis, crystals powered a lot of things. They were the light sources, they had laser swords, they had healing wands that were crystalline. They even built their cities in crystalline matter. So crystals are the way of the future.
But we'll get to Atlantis a little later, no worries. So, but yeah, and I think that sounds spot on. And especially how it conducts, you know, spiritual energy, but also it's safe to say that even if those chairs wouldn't have given him visions or whatever, that place was inhabited at the time by what we would interpret as gods, because not just the inscriptions, which one of them actually said that Kronos lived here, but the fact that those chairs and furniture actually was part of the environment, which means that they probably modeled it with their minds. And so also when Cesar tried to penetrate with the time machine from the previous book, this place, to figure out its origins, he was met with the biggest of all the mental barriers that he had encountered. So clearly the ETs that made the Buchej complex did not want him finding out what was the origin there. Also, he mentions that Romanians don't just have that one mind, they have so many other, of course that is nailed on to be the biggest one, but they have a history, especially the Apusen Mountains, where they gave the Romans hundreds of tons of gold and silver, and not just them, but the Russians and the Hungarians and the Ottomans. But so they got out of that place, the archaeologists, and they had an interdiction from going there from the highest authorities because they consider it too dangerous. And they did make efforts to locate it, but even Cesar failed to do it. That's how well it was covered, although it's known approximately where it is. So also apparently this language that was the original was what the Romans, their vulgaris, their day-to-day version was the same as this, and it was spoken in many other places, or very, very close to it. I also, lastly, before we get into the Inside of the Earth book, wanted to mention a significant part of the third book, which I forgot, which actually fits in chronologically right now the best, because as I mentioned, that large accumulation of gold, well, this is the best example of its effects. In his very first hologram of the history of humanity, Radu was shown at one point as a close-up of the Apusen Mountains, which are the ones that have all this gold, but actually this Orostia mine, that is the biggest one, is just south of them. But anyway, he was shown the only real civilization remaining after the last great flood. They lived in hamlets, and they were blonde, and they were about 2 meters tall, and they were very light skinned, almost glowing. And the men had beards, and they subsisted on bees and actually agriculture. And this was about 10 to 9,000 years ago, this vision of their way of life. And it also showed how they were extremely contemplative, and this was their main activity. And they would spend hours on the ground, just, intently thinking, but they didn't have concern whether they were rained on or anything. And the men relied mainly on sheep, and the women would do the clothes, and their clothes were linen and white, and they all had belts. It seems like even ETs, everyone has belts all the time. But they were also very spiritually evolved. And when they would come home, the men and women would embrace. And although they were the only real population, he got this strong knowledge that it was the only one, but at the time left. But they still lived in hamlets, and it was very scattered. And now it gets into the more supernatural side of things. So they had simple huts which only had an opening for a door, and they had a bed that was low to the ground. And when they went to sleep, they had a natural sort of light, which was just their will, and it was faint and pleasant, and it diminished as soon as they went to sleep, slowly, but still remained. And the other example of paranormal ability was when they formed a circle, 5 men and 4 women, on the crest of a mountain, because all of these people lived not on the plain, but on the slopes of hills and mountains. And it was a very powerful vision that I think made Radu cry, but of them holding hands and meditating in a circle. And they didn't have rituals that we would think of them, so they didn't have objects or anything. They were very simplistic in that way. But after this union, one by one, they dematerialized. Also, they had formed an enormous vertical light that was golden. But yeah, this was the end of his vision, that they all disappeared. And we can correlate this to a certain part of the 6th book. So this is going to come full circle. But at the time, it was all very, very mysterious. But so the 5th book gets into the earth, which Radu, as I said, got a much better position where he had to deal with the administrative part. Like, he had to plan out those missions in the tunnels, and he even got the freedom to go in the projection hall, which he did, and he spent hours there. Also, they upgraded their base by the 5th book a lot. For example, they no longer relied on security. They reduced that by some 90% because they installed, using the Americans, holographic cloaking tech of the type that we hear in the SSP, and also the energetic shields that they wore bracelets and give you some tingling sensation when you went through it. That was almost to the level of the one that was left there, but so that made it easier. And because they didn't want security there for privacy reasons, and also many of them weren't ready, and they had to shuffle them all the time because it actually is a slightly higher frequency of vibration in that room, so it's hard to withstand. But also, not just the holographic tech, but also they installed machines that we hear about as harp having, which is ones that change your emotional state. But this type was even much more refined, because whenever you approached it, they would just send you dizziness and the feeling of deterring it, but very slightly. And the more you approach it, the more pronounced it got. But Radu said that this cloaking technology was almost like magic to him, and that it used materials that were foreign to him, and that maybe you could shed some light on how this works, because he doesn't go into any more detail.
Yeah, so the cloaking technology that I got to see for the Mars basis, it's electromagnetic frequency, right? It generates a dome around the base and it cloaks it. So there's frequency generators that produce this electromagnetic cloaking frequency. And it is very much, it looks sort of like a dome, but it's not made of glass. It's made of electromagnetic frequency that repels space junk, repels anything like asteroids. And it also cloaks the bases from being detected by satellites, radars, and telescopes. So it could be generators, right, that you put on the ground, and it generates the electromagnetic frequency field. And you can do this around a whole large base, or you can do it around a whole planet. And then the generators are powered by anti-grav propulsion systems. And you have 4, 7, or 10 generators that are flying around the planet, and they become stationary in the orbit, and they create these fields, also electromagnetic fields, and boom, the planet is cloaked and you can't see it. Or it could be a planetary generator inside the planet, huge one, that cloaks the planet. There's different ways of creating electromagnetic field frequencies to cloak something. And it's very much holographic technology, because it generates the electromagnetic field and a hologram. It makes you see something different than what is really inside, being protected inside the electromagnetic field. So this technology doesn't just hide things, it also protects things from being hit by planetoids, asteroids, space junk. So it works 2 ways: to shield and cloak with the holographic stuff, to also with the electromagnetic field protect from anything invading you, anything going inside what's being cloaked and shielded. So this is what I remember on Mars. This is what I remember when I went to Venus. It has the same cloaking around the citadel, complexes that the ancient builder races left behind. That is all shielded with electromagnetic frequencies. And you have to have the coding. There's symbols. You have to open up the coding, press certain symbols to deactivate the shielding to go inside these citadel complexes, which it was crystalline. It was sort of like an obelisk shaped, but more wider. And it was crystalline technology, and it was green and glowing. And it was protected by the electromagnetic field. So you just see barren places on Venus with there's patches of water going closer underground and where the mountains are. Because once upon a time, Venus very much was like Earth. The temperatures are hot there, but it's not completely unbearable. So if you're wearing a smart suit, you can walk on the surface of the planet and you can see the domed cities, the remnants of the domed cities that had cloaking around it. You could actually see that, but you don't see the citadels. Those are completely cloaked. So I've seen this on Venus as well.
Yeah, I'm sure they are the same, that they serve the dual purpose of also shielding, because Radu pointed out that their efficiency in building it, that it would seem like they could do it on any planet. And no doubt that he was right about that. But also he mentions how Cesar, by 2015 or so, when he got to visit inside the Earth for the first time, Cesar had already performed 34 trips, and many of them to Hollow Earth, and a few of them he had done alone. But in the beginning, he had to go with Americans. But after 2010, after the 4th book, he had much more liberty as well, and he could go alone. And finally, he invites him to go along with him. And
He invites Radu?
Yes. This is the type of thing where you have to get acclimatized very gradually. You can't just, because the tunnel, actually, the middle one, which led to Inner Earth, had a further ramification where one of the tunnels led to inner Earth and one led to hollow Earth. Next, he spends about, I don't know, 100 pages explaining why hollow Earth is, factual, and that the literature on it is good, but it's way incomplete. And it's a wonder why it's considered a conspiracy, because you might as well say that the solid Earth theory is the conspiracy, for how much it's really just a series of assumptions and extrapolations. And also regarding the literature, there's no good map of hollow Earth that I've seen, except the one that's in a book that called Goddess of Advatabar, which contains a map that has a certain city that was mentioned by Andromedans, and the fact that it was corroborated by them makes me think that the other cities on that map, which I will include in this, are also factual. So just that I mentioned it. And the accepted structure of the Earth is that there is a crust for about 50 to 70 kilometers, and then a mantle for a couple of thousand of kilometers, and inside there is an inner and outer core, and that it's the dynamism between these that creates a magnetic field. And they are using such outdated methods. For example, Cavendish lead balls, they still rely on them 200 years later, which are based on Newton's law of gravity, which presupposes that gravity is the same everywhere. And also, these lead balls imply that there is no electricity imprint or charge on the planet, which even just a storm contains 1 billion amps or more, and not just the gravity, but the electromagnetic field is 1 trillion times stronger than the gravity. So also, the way they got to the conclusion that the core is made of nickel and iron largely, and that they maintain that 1/3 of the Earth's mass is actually nickel and iron. But the problem was, and the way they extrapolate is using these Cavendish balls that are just a few centimeters long, and they extrapolated this from the fact that at the near the surface, the density of the Earth is 2.5 to 3 grams per cubic centimeter, and they know from the rotation, the orbit of the Earth and its mass, that its average density is 5.5, and so they had to interpret that the middle part is much heavier to even out this discrepancy. So then they got to that idea, that notion that it's 1/3 iron, and that would be extremely uncharacteristic, because all the other planets in the solar system are acknowledged as only being 2 to 3% iron. But that's just the entree, because their deepest holes, their boreholes, for example, one in Kola, Russia, that was the deepest one, which is 12.5 kilometers, but also others, for example, in Germany, that are close to that deep, which are not very deep if you think about the fact that you have to dig over 6,300 kilometers to get to the core. Just that should tell you that it's all guesswork. But these findings in these tunnels also go against all the existing textbooks, because the pressure and the density and the temperature and the gravity all have different trajectories than was predicted. And the basalt as well, they figured that it would be found always at the 5 kilometer mark, which in the case of Kola, they had to dig almost twice as deep. And with the temperature, they were completely convinced that it would rise 100 every 100 meters by 1 degree Celsius. But it turns out that it often happened twice as fast, and not just that, but once it heats up, it can actually go lower, which totally surprised them. And all these finds are very neatly, swept under the rug by them. and they have no idea how the earthquakes, how the volcano eruptions, and all these things occur. And also they misidentify the earthquakes as only happening at a certain depth, because lower than that, the plates are too ductile, and they think that it only goes 150 kilometers, but there have been recorded earthquakes of magnitude 8 and higher at 650 kilometers deep, and that shows that there are fractures there, and that it's not as soft, the material, as they think, just because it's higher temperature. And it shows that it's comparable to the surface, actually. And I should also interject. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so how does this connect to Radu and Caesar going to Inner Earth?
Well, that was just the end of, because it represents, the exposition for Hollow Earth. Because many, even of your viewers, it's one thing to accept that Inner Earth exists, and most everyone does, but the idea that the Earth is hollow in the middle, that is stretched too far for many people. So I thought, because the book also dedicates so much time, I should just dedicate about a 10-minute stretch to this. So, and also I wanted to add, because I asked her permission, and Penny Bradley, our mutual friend, confirmed that she was taught Hollow Earth theory by the Germans in Schule. And so I thought that was pretty cool. And next, he gets some more initiation into this. I'm going to gloss over it, by Dr. Shen.
Was it Caesar or Radu?
Radu, because Cesar was extremely, well versed in this. He didn't need any more explanation. And this is all about leading people into this. And so Dr. Shen told him that it's actually a mistake to even call it a cavity inside the Earth, because it gave him the example of, he drew a circle, and that he made a mark in the center, and said that if you were in 2D, you would be confined to the circle. But if you look at it from a 3D perspective, it's irrelevant to say that it's inside or outside. And it's the same with Hollow Earth. And that there is a triangular dance in the universe, and that involves magnetic and electric fields, which together form matter, and that matter comes down to 3 components as well, which is space, time, and mass. And he also mentioned that always going inside the Earth is a sort of a spiritual journey, and it feels like a homecoming of sorts, and that you should look at it as the planet itself has a soul, and that it's on an evolutionary level, just like us, just on a different one, and that its core is basically its heart, which is the point that you can't touch, which is close to infinity. And then regarding this this idea that it's a spiritual journey, and your mind will eventually wander there, at least in astral. I was going to ask you if you felt this yourself when you were in Telos.
Yeah, I very much was given permission there to go, because my soul was ready to go to see the libraries, because there's the Telosian library, Pagalthos, and that library, it has a lot of stuff. It has stuff in metal tablets. It has stuff in written form, like scrolls and things. There's so many languages. It has stuff on crystalline, little circular discs, crystalline discs that you could touch, and the holographic information comes up. So the Pagalthos library, it has so many different formats of how you can see information, and everything is sacred to them. Nothing, they even have books from the surface that they've collected. So that ancient Sumerian, Egyptian, everything on the history of this planet, because we've been around for a long time, not just 9,000 years, not what the archaeological scale tells us. We've been around for millions of years in various forms of our civilization, from advanced to when we fell because of the flooding and the destruction and and back to what we're now. The Telosians have all of that as a record, how it happened, when it happened, why it happened, and it's all in different formats. And they have a lot of crystalline technology. I saw the huge towers, the crystalline towers that were transported to tell us when Atlantis fell. I got to see those, but I had to prepare the frequency of the mind and the body to match to those tower frequencies because they're huge. The energy output of the towers is huge. So when I was in Inner Earth and Telos specifically, even the food has a different vibration because they could simulate meat, but it's not a meat product. They don't eat their animals. They create the meat differently. It can be synthesized with plant material. They could synthesize food that tastes like meat, but it's not meat. It's made from plant material and other proteins and enzymes. So they could simulate the meat, but it's not real meat, but it tastes the same. It holds the frequency of the food without the frequency of the animal who produced it. We haven't figured that out yet on Earth, but it's very nutritious, it's very healthy, and it vibrates at a very healthy capacity energetically. So everything they do and tell us is calibrated to the proper energy frequency of just positivity, healing. I didn't feel anything negative there. And I went to several places. I went to the Pagalthos Library. I went to the Telosian cities. I went to where their crystalline rooms are. And the frequencies are all 4, 5D, and even 6D densities, especially where the crystalline rooms are. So I always felt safe. I always felt welcomed. And I saw saber-toothed tigers just walking around in their dome parks. And they're not aggressive. They're not attacking anybody. They're just animals that they've preserved in Inner Earth that would scare people on the surface because those animals did have aggressive tendencies, but these ones, they don't have that. That's not genetically in their blueprint anymore. So these beings are able to shift a lot of things in a very positive vibration. And it's all done by consent and free will choice. And you go to Inner Earth when your soul frequency, when that soul frequency is ready and it's evolved enough to go in, that's when they let you in. If you're not vibrating on the scale that matches that frequency, you can't really go in. So soul evolution has to frequency wise be at 4, 5, and 6D to even get in there. You have to vibrate at the frequency.
Yeah, that's a perfect appetizer actually for what's to come. You confirmed so many things already. And he at the beginning, he when he was still skeptical, he says that what if he were in a 3D capsule and it was just that you could see through and he would just be sent through it. And he got quickly, corrected on this, that our 3D technology wouldn't even be able to penetrate. But at any rate, because you have to be compatible with the frequency, and you mentioned that it goes up to 6D. That's exactly the description of Dr. Shen as well. It's basically a gradient that starting with once you leave the mantle, which is the last part that they identify correctly, that you enter the etheric realm, or 4D, and eventually even get to 6D. And that's the last one, at least on this, planet. And that you change your perception automatically, that trying to figure out with our physical perception of things how it is down there is tantamount to trying to get close to a fire with a stick with ice on the end. So by the time you're gonna get to the fire, your ice will be melted. So it's a different perception. And he gives a lot of examples, but I'm just gonna cover the fact that the essential mechanism of the planetary formation, so you get an idea of why it is how it is down there, is the fundamental part is water, and subtle water, which exists all around us, and you could call it ether, I guess, but that one gets converted by a vortex. As I said before about the magnetic and electric fields emanating matter, matter always creates a ripple or like a vortex. That's how it said that the centers of planets and suns and celestial bodies is a huge vortex, and as it's referred in the book, it's a central black hole. But also it's another misconception that the black holes only attract, they also emanate at least as much. So for example, the center of the galaxy is responsible for 99% of the matter, which is starting to get accepted more and more in mainstream science as well. And this subtle water is converted into ice initially, and this ice then returns, because it's a vortex, it forms a sphere, and on its way collects cosmic dust and other matter, and this forms a lid around it, and that's why planets only grow to a certain size. And in the case that they're suns, they are much bigger, and then the common element is fire. And then the fact that that humans are made from clay is more literal than you would think, as it says in the Bible, because water is everything. And the theory of accretion is just absurd, which is that bodies are hitting each other, and that's how planets are formed. They're small particles, and it's in their view down to chance, but it's anything but. It's a self-organizing process. And this central black hole of the planet, if you will, is findable, is a fundamental like vortex in any body, and actually you could say in anything, because even the atom is like as above so below. You can find it everywhere. And then he mentions that there are several ways in which you get inside, and the easiest is the way of the poles, for the reason that the magnetic field and gravitational field, the way they're aligned, and the fact that there's basically next to no magnetism when you're inside the cone at the poles, and then that creates a change in your frequency of vibration. And in the case that you're prepared and that you aspire to maintain that frequency of vibration, then, and or if you're, say, invited there, by someone like Admiral Byrd was, then you will pass to the other side, and that you could say is a type of portal. But it's not like in many of the books that maintain that there's like a corridor. There is no such thing. There is no physical opening. What happens, according to this book, which is adamant about it, is that there is a subtle passage, and it gives the example of a Mobius strip. So basically you don't even realize it until you see subtle hints. For example, you notice vegetation that is out of place or creatures that are out of place. Also, just the fact that the snow requirements at the poles, it's within a certain window of temperature, and it's way warmer than it should be. It's clear that what accounts for the dust and the warm winds and the tide patterns and the fact that auroras are at both poles, and that there are thermal ejections on other planets that are easily observable, is obviously the fact that there's an inner sun. And this inner sun gives the sustenance to the inside, and it's interpreted by us actually as very close to a sun, but that's how we see it, because it's actually just a radiation produced by the absorption of matter, because as I said, it's a black hole, and it's 2/3 of our sun in intensity. You can look at it more or less, but it still hurts a little bit, and it has slightly different colors. It's more tends towards the white, and the caverns are more and more honeycombed as you get towards the hollow. And this is even proven by the seismograms. They have very large caverns near the core, which is misinterpreted as being liquid and solid by them. But also, what we think is a haunted place is oftentimes a passageway, like a haunted forest or such, to the etheric plane or hollow earth. It's just different frequencies overlapping. And you usually find your way back without, oftentimes without even knowing. In the case of Bermuda Triangle, that also is apparently a passageway, and that's one of the other main themes, but that is the waterway in, if you will. So the lengths of these portals or chasms depends very much, it's a case by case basis. And the one in under the Bucej complex was more or less permanent. It was technology based, but oftentimes they happen naturally, which is a decision really of the planet because it has its own meridian or energetic lines in the etheric realm plane and higher. That is always what, and because they're unseen, that makes them, hard to interpret by the scientists, but they account for not just the strange events like the earthquakes and volcano eruptions, but also for the cavities, because when there are two or more of these lines that form a vortex, then you can't have matter there. So that's why you have those caverns. And it says that many of them are inhabited by peoples, but almost always they are more refined, and only at the surface do you find some ETs that have been here from strange, turn of events, but they are restricted from going deeper and they're isolated. And you have networks, for example, under Romania, and they all exchange information, although they all have their own personality. But anyway, more on that in a little bit. So he finally got to go through the portal, and it had two distortions, and they were meant to accommodate him to raise his frequency of vibration. And after he got through the second one, he looked back and he saw these undulations, and Cesar, who was going to accompany him on all these trips, suggested that he took his keys out of his pocket and threw them behind the distortion. And once he did that, the keys completely disappeared. And this suggested that they were already in a higher plane of existence, and that he told him that he would find these keys exactly where he left them. It's just that he wouldn't be able to see them from where they were. And also, I wanted to just quickly ask you if one of your modes of entry was this, or how did you get inside? Tell us.
Well, I had photographed something with my camera. I think it was a spider and or a flower or something like that. And I had changed it into a fractal patterning. And this is what opened up as I was doing the mathematical fractal. As the pattern was emerging, it actually looked like one of the Telosian symbols to get into Telos energetically. And that opened up a portal right in front of my computer screen. So it felt like a wormhole. I went in consciously. When I went in through it, I felt like my soul and my body went in. Everything went in. I went through that, and it was energy. So I was traveling energetically through it. When I came out, I did see a lot of corridors and tunnel systems and different doors with portal systems. Behind those doors, as it was explained to me by the Telosians, there's many different portal systems going in and out. So there's different ways of getting in and out. Everything looked marble like pink, white marble, because they're the Telosian cities. They build their stuff from marble-like substance. So a lot of pink hues, white hues everywhere. And they're in the center, right? There was that symbol that I created. So it was purely accidental because I activated a fractal patterning that's connected to their symbol, and that opened up a gate, the portal system. And that was my invitation. That was the activation that I was ready to go. I went in, and I got to see male and female liaisons. I just call them liaisons. And they were the ones that took me to the places that I wanted to see, because I wanted to see the crystal rooms. I wanted to see the Pagalthos library. I wanted to see the nature preserves and how they grow their food. So I had very specific places that I wanted to be and go in. And I didn't ask to meet a Dhamma. I didn't ask to have a spiritual celestial commune. I just asked to see places that I was really interested in, that I had read about, Inner Earth. They were very kind and obliged me. I think I was there the first time for a couple of hours, then the next time for a couple of days. And I really wanted to learn all about the crystal stuff. And they have, in the crystal rooms, they have these huge crystals that you can enter inside, right? Like, it looks like quartz. You can enter inside and your soul sees everything that's part of creation. Like, everything that's part of creation was ever created or will be created. You can see that inside while you're inside this crystal pod, if you will, I guess, because it's a huge crystal that energetically allows you to go inside it. I know crystals are solid, but that crystal wasn't solid. Once you touch it, it became energy. You entered in, then it became solid, and you could see everything that was ever formed in creation or whatever will be formed. So this is what I got to experience, and I was like, wow, the frequencies felt eighth dimensional. So in the 8th dimension or higher, 8D, if you will. And that was beyond anything I had ever experienced or seen. To see everything, of how everything is created, of how universes are created, and it's not just from stardust and it's matter. Everything is created from matter, and that matter creates something else like the stardust. So everything is connected to frequency and matter. This is what this crystalline technology showed me. And I was there about an hour inside it. Then once I was ready, I disconnected from the frequency of it and left it. And left the crystal room. So that was very significant to me, that visit. And it'll be in my upcoming book, because I'm working on a different book. I didn't really talk about Inner Earth too much in these 2 books, but
I noticed that, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of experiences that I've had, but this is the Inner Earth experience that stood out in my mind, the crystal stuff. Because when you're in these crystal rooms, there's different crystals. There's bigger ones, smaller ones, and you can touch the crystal and you can see something from the universe, how something is happening in the universe or happened, because those crystals are literally universal library repositories. They're not just, and they hold the frequency of Telos. They also hold that protective frequency of shielding their city. So nobody can just stumble in and walk in. There's the frequencies of these crystals is what shield that particular city. You can't just go boom, boom, boom. There's a frequency shield around the city because of these large crystal towers that are in the crystalline rooms. That's what I learned from that experience. So I would say you don't really stumble in there through one of the portal systems by accident. It's either activated with an invitation, you go in through the poles, or you can go in through Mount Shasta if you get lost. There's a portal system in there to get into Telos. That's true. For me, it was I just drew something with a mathematical fractalization process, and it happened to be the symbol for Telos, for the city. So that alerted them that I was ready energetically and physically to get an invite. Yep. It wasn't that I was asking for it. I was aware and wanting to visit at some point, but not at that point, but they thought I was ready. And because I drew the symbol and activated that energetic key sequence, it showed them it's time to get her introduced.
That's actually a unique way of getting it. I didn't count on hearing that, and now is a great time for you to publish this information. I would say the demand is bigger than ever, and it's interesting that you said that you first only went for a couple of hours, and you also foreshadowed other things, and then for longer periods, that come to find that there are many similarities with the other civilizations from underneath Romania. So he then goes through this portal, and before that he had to arrange with the one of the wise men from inside the town that we were first going to visit, which was called Tomasis, and it was very deep down low. It was almost more than 1,500 kilometers down. And according to this book, the limit of the mantle is roughly 2,500 kilometers. And it was so down low that it wasn't quite in the etheric dimension density, but it was, you could very much feel it. It was definitely different. And so we got into this, first of all, into this station that was closer to the surface. There was a giant room in a semicircular shape. And then he got greeted by this guy who, through the holographic technology in front of the tunnel, had arranged this meeting, and he gave them the go-ahead. And he was about 50 years old and blonde and bearded and in a robe of a monk. And he greeted them there in that station, and he spoke telepathically to Radu, but also he could hear the voice as well. And it was in the language that no doubt was the original Indo-European language because of its terminations, which sounded like a cross between Greek and Latin. And then he read his mind. So he didn't rely on Radu speaking to him. He just answered him the minute that he thought something. And as soon as he realized that Radu was a little intimidated by the language, he switched to Romanian with a slight accent. And they went to a lift that was see-through, but it wasn't glass. It was a transparent metal, just like in the SSP. And through it, they very quickly, in a matter of like half a minute or a minute, descended so many layers of the mantle, including earth, rocks, and in the middle, a couple of stretches of lava. And in that case, they got engulfed, the whole lift, in a glow and also slight warmth. And it was beautiful. And they got to Tomasis eventually, which was located exactly below the main port city in Romania. And initially, we'll find the connection is not coincidental at all, because that place, before it was called what it is today, Constanța, it was first a city of Dacians. And it turns out that the Dacians retreated inside this inner earth cavern around 2,000 years ago, when they got, conquered by the Romans. At first, well, he'll get into the history a little later, but what he saw there was a very large cavern, but he could feel the differences already. The vegetation was thicker and lower, and it seemed like it was made to that way so it would absorb more light, because the light source was very different there. It was basically the ceiling. There was a diffuse light, and it was orange, and it had some fog that was moving on top. And in the very far distance, so behind them was just mountains, if you want, or just a wall, but he called it a mountain. And they were on a platform above the city overlooking Tomasis. And in the far distance, he could see what he called a sea, but it could also have been a lake, because it's not that large of a cavern, because he said that the height was only 200 meters. And the source of light was actually lava, a pool of lava that was separated by a few layers of rock. And apparently elements inside the more subtle, environments like that arrange themselves just automatically by the will of the planet. And they make up for certain lacks. For example, oxygen is a little lower, but you still have it. But also you don't need it just because of the more refined atmosphere. And he sensed a certain natural intelligence throughout the place, and very strong sensations of like inner confidence, and he could think much clearer. And yeah, it was hard for him to readjust when he returned. And he couldn't notice many animals, just a bird, small bird, and he didn't think there were many more. And they were on this platform, and they instantly got approached by a few anti-gravity platforms, not unlike the one in the occult room, but a little different. They were a little translucent and a different metal, but they got on one of them, him and Drain, Radu, and Cesar, and there were another couple of guards with them from Thomas's. They got on the third one, and it automatically led them, but without any vertigo. You would think that, there were no barriers or anything. It's just them on that board, and they got them to the other end of town, the sea end, and it took them about 10 minutes, but he couldn't take any detours, although he wanted to, because it was spectacular. And he noticed that the architecture was very much like ancient Greece. The houses were no more than 2 floors, and they had that particular squarish shape, and they looked simple, but actually very, tasteful, and parts that were modern, that when he would zoom in, and that applied for the humans and the way they clothe as well. It's a combination of new and old. And apparently, so we got greeted there by a few Dacians, because it turns out that they were the direct descendants, the pure-blooded, although obviously they no longer had the same trajectory, so their evolution was kind of accelerated. And the way they got in there 2,000 years ago was, first of all, just priests had access to it. But after the conquest, more and more got through those portals, because obviously it's way too far down to go manually. And they have this principle that is based on wisdom, that they always put their wisest in charge, and that almost always is the oldest. And this is always also the case with advanced CT civilizations. It seems like we're the only ones who don't go by that, and that they weren't the original inhabitants of the place. First, it was passed off to them by very short creatures. I think they were a meter tall or less, and they passed off because there were certain changes that led to them not being able to withstand either temperature or something. And before them there were other ETs, so they got basically bequeathed this place. And then this Dacian lady who got talked to Radu, because of the 3, 2 of them went in the center of town with Cesar to discuss future sharing of technology, because they, although from the outside looked a little simplistic in terms of the way of life, actually their technology was far ahead of us. And it seems that sharing of technology is one of their main goals with us, that they're finally acknowledging that we are on the precipice of being able to use this and not be too destructive with it. And I was going to ask you if this is also the case with Telos, that they are intent on sharing, their findings, because also I found that these inner Earth peoples are recently formed a coalition of 36 of them. I'm not sure if this is true, but I just wanted to ask if you could confirm that they are, willing to share their advanced technology.
Well, since the crystalline towers were entrusted to them, so they wouldn't be used by their reptilians and then Anunnaki, they take guarding them very seriously. So they would have to see that we're ready for the crystalline technology to come back to the surface. It's about how ready are we? How evolved are we as a species? We're not even 1 on the Kardashev scale. So the evolution is not there yet. We're not at the present time ready for crystalline towers to suddenly appear on the surface, start using immense energy of crystals. We have to figure out how to vibrate with the crystals, how to commune with the crystals, to even tap into the piezoelectric frequencies of the crystals And some of us are able to do this because we meditate, we attune with the crystal essence of the piezoelectric field, because every crystal has a different variation of the frequency, right? Depending on the crystal. And so you have to get attuned with that to use the crystal as an energy field for healing, for psychic work, for whatever you're doing with it. Because you can program crystals for specific opportunities and specific purposes that you could work with it for. We're just starting to figure out how to do that with the crystals, but we're not ready for huge crystalline towers, which give us unlimited energy sources and supplies. So I think they're very careful with wanting to know when we'll be ready for this. And I don't think this is right now. Perhaps they'll be sharing holographic technology with us at some point. And there's always the robes. Again, for me, was like when I went down there, was either a white cream robe that was offered to me or a blue one, because I prefer light blue. So always was offered the robes, tunic and a robe that went over it, something tunic dress with a robe. Sometimes the robe had a hood, sometimes it didn't. It depended on where I was going. And I got to meet a saber-toothed tiger without the aggressiveness in it. So I don't think they're ready to give us the crystalline technology because that's advanced, and we're not. Again, they look at how advanced as a species have you gotten to? Where have you gotten to? We still have wars, we still have famine, we still have pain and suffering. So obviously, until all that gets sorted out and we become a peaceful civilization that's no longer fighting with each other, they're waiting for us to have peace. They're waiting for us to end our own issues on the surface before they entrust us with this technology. So until they see some soul growth, I don't think we're going to get technology that would allow us to do something drastically on the surface of the planet. Let's put it that way.
No, yeah, that's correct, and they are painfully aware that we're not ready. That's why they are only planning on the very drip by drip sharing. And I forgot to mention that the lady he got talking to looked 30 and very athletic, and that's because she was part of the security. She was actually kind of a minister of security, but she was actually 54, and this is because they age slower because of the different frequencies there. And also that she was part of experience exchange programs, and she would visit the surface every 13 years or so for a few years, for 3 years or so. And that you have to be birthed on the surface in almost every case because of celestial influences that you would be, robbed of if you were down there. So it's very important for them, and there are exceptions to that. And which is kind of similar to how you get birth, how even the SSP said that you should not give birth on ships, although that does happen too. And he had very limited time, being the first time. He gets led back to that mountain, and he saw what he interpreted as a tunnel, but actually it was just a black circle on the side of the mountain. In front of it was a capsule-shaped ship, and she explained the workings of it to him. She was quite knowledgeable about it. He said that it converted the gravity field into a magnetic field, and that you would use two types of magnetic fields and combine them in various ways. And it's essentially that was the power source, but it goes into a little more depth. But that it also uses some gels inside of the ship, which was its shell was very thick. It had 3 layers, and inside there were 3 seats on each side, and they were of material that would bend to your weight. So if you just tapped your finger a little bit, it would be hard, but if you pressed it slowly, it would morph. And he said that it would be such a treat for people who are sedentary to have that type of material. But then in that capsule, and also the reason why they didn't dig tunnels, obviously it wasn't realistic. He was going to go to another inner Earth cavern / city, but it was very far away and there was no way they were going to dig through it. So they have to essentially raise the frequency of vibration of the ship, and that makes it able to traverse the 3D space. And then inside he got showed quickly moving and vivid and intuitive holograms of exactly where he was at that place, but correlated with the geography of the surface. And you could see that there are many other such cities underground and many other caverns. And he got eventually, actually very quickly, in a few minutes, to Apelos, which is the only other city that is explored. And it was much larger, although less tall, but it was much more populous. And the architecture was different. It sounded more similar to Telos because it was crystalline and it had spirals or certainly circular buildings, and that shined and were translucent and whitish. And he also saw that the vegetation was more lush and there were oak trees and even streams. And unfortunately, he had limited time there, only about 45 minutes. So he had to contend with just looking at it from above. And fortunately, they gave him access to a hologram, not dissimilar to the one in the Buceci complex, which showed him that a bit about the history of the place. So it's much higher than Thomas's. It was only 70 kilometers underground. And the way it got inhabited, first of all, was by very archaic people of Romania many thousands of years ago, who actually, this one had a connection to the outside through tunnels, but they were very multi-level, they're very squiggly and very difficult to go through, and had many obstacles like water. And he got showed in this hologram, which also was intuitive, and he would guide it just through his mind, but he got a little help from the men there, that the first people who descended were very simplistically dressed and weren't ready actually to inhabit that place because it was just too arid, too rocky, and too dark, first of all. So we don't know what happened to them, but the next vision is also people from around the same time, but this time they were accompanied by what he could make out were Nordic-looking people who had those specific tight-fitting blue overalls, and they clearly got help there, maybe because they saw their first attempt, and they reported, the hologram showed large orbs or floating spheres of light, but there was tech, and that they brought a lot of bales and sacks with them, so they finally got a foothold there. And they have trade there with the outside because they can't grow, obviously, the many sources of food that we do on the surface. So they're still dependent on the surface population. And the way they transport it is through even more advanced technology than the capsule ships. It is through a teleportation that apparently creates a certain field line from the surface to this town, and they apparently have many storerooms that are in places that are just slightly underground, and they are very heavily guarded because they're far from the only in Earth place. And so this teleportation, which is quite recent because it represented a problem to them for a long time, is he makes the comparison that it's like a shower because it's like an arch and then it has a circle over it and it's 3 meters wide, and not just materials, but people can go through it, and it's not instantaneous, but as good as. And you only feel a little bit of dizziness, but you're fine. And then I just wanted to make a small parallel that the friendship case, which is a famous ufology case, they also had teleportation, and they made their own inner cavities. And unlike these that were natural, because most of these peoples live in caverns that were left there by nature. But in this case, they had the technology to create their own cavities. Next, he gets returned, and this whole trip was just 2.5 hours, and he just went into deep sleep afterwards because there was so much information to absorb. So he then, after a few days, gets finally to visit Hollow Earth, and that's through the second tunnel. And Cesar, who always accompanied him, mentioned that the first time he went through, he didn't know what to expect, and they took equipment with them that would to measure where they were in space, but it completely stopped working as soon as they passed the first distortion. And the reason why, so when they first got to Hollow Earth, it wasn't quite like they expected. It was on an isolated island, and it wasn't very large, a few hundred meters, and he could see how it curved. And it was very lush. It was like tropical vegetation, although the temperature was quite cool. And the reason that it wasn't already like a city or something, or a station, was that a calamity took place in Hollow Earth, which I thought was interesting because you hear only positive stuff there. And the people who were responsible for it thought that this tunnel that the Bucheja architects left there was too important, for humanity to cease to exist. And so they repaired it, and they put this island in place just as a buffer. And they slowly got approached by a guardian. That's how he's described. He was tall. He was 3 meters tall, and he only would get to you once you would be finished with your conversation with whoever you were with. If you were alone, you would get greeted by him instantly. But as it was here in a group, you couldn't rush this process of him getting to you. He would always get to you, because this is just one of the first signs that he was in the etheric plane. He no longer, the physical plane rules no longer applied. And after more explanation of the differences between planes and how it's a mistake to measure like we do, that also the gradient of 4 to 60 that I mentioned isn't necessarily linear like we would think. But for example, Shambhala, which is a famous city and it's very real, you could say it's the capital. That one, although it's higher than the etheric, you can see it from the ground. So that's just to say that once you're inside, you don't measure it like you would think. And also, the reason why you don't see the curvature quite as much, you do see it with the inside curvature, but it's the fact that it's a bigger hole or hollow than we give it credit for. So it's true that the mantle is about 2,500 kilometers, and that doesn't leave that big of a place. But because it's in the etheric realm, it's actually the size of Venus. And this is quite conveniently confirmed by the Mayan calendar, because it's 260 days long, which is close to Venus, which is 235. So Mayan calendar is not, haphazardly so, because it's known that they had portals there. And so after the guardian catches up to them, he was not very well defined in the book. He just wore blue trousers and white shirt, and he was smiling and very kind. And apparently he was a guardian of Shambhala. And he knew obviously from the start that this was just an initiation for Radu. And so we spoke to him also only ever telepathically. Inner Earth people might still speak, but apparently it's always quiet in Hollow Earth. You can, but almost no one does it, speak. And they got on a boat that was just wooden, simple, and the Guardian pulled out an oar and just rowed them closer to the outskirts of Shambhala just so he could see it, but it was still quite far. And he got a really ecstatic vibe from it, Radu, when he saw that it was also crystalline and but much more imposing in stature, and the architecture was much taller and just broader. And he got the impression that it was very elevated, and he really wanted more, but uh, he was denied. And even Cesar mm, only got to visit a few times, but I'm sure I have a suspicion that book 8 is going to be about his visit to Shambhala, because it's almost certain that he'll get there. He could only see the first ring of it, though, because it's separated by rings, maybe not unlike Atlantis, but apparently that has more to do, in the case of Atlantis, that's to replicate this elevated place like Shambhala, because there it's a matter of different planes. It gets more and more elevated towards the center. So probably the Eye of Sahara and Atlantis were just kind of mimicking this. But so this was very short-lived, and then he returns, and their second of 3 Hollow Earth trips was in the Yosemite Mountains. Him and Radu got tasked with this, that they had to explore as one of their high strangenesses that the American government didn't care to force themselves upon too much, because it involved Native Americans and their esoteric traditions, and even if they wanted to, they couldn't pull much out of them. So they also failed to get through to them. So knowing that the Radu and Cesar had a lot of experience with this, they recruited them, and they were happy to oblige. And they visited this Native American tribe in the Yosemite Park, and it doesn't disclose the exact location, but it does give quite good description of the whereabouts. So if you were really intent, I'm sure you could find it on Google Maps, because it's quite valuable in a way, because it had a portal to Hollow Earth in one of those houses, which apparently dates back to 1776, and they were so reverential to the fact that they found a passage to Hollow Earth there, that they left in the inside of that house exactly as they found it. So it's just dry earth and a few logs and a few other scattered things there. And they got met there in America by a couple of Native Americans, one who just oversaw this, and the other one who was called Mezina, which means the youngest of the family. She was very clearly a native because of her strong features, but she was young. She was about 20. And she chanted a certain tone that, alongside a dagger that the other man pulled, which was very worn out and wooden and had carvings, the combination of the two spawned this portal that was also energetic. And the Mezina had to probe both of them one by one to see if they were ready, because most everyone who the Americans had sent there didn't pass this test. And Cesar quickly, passed muster, but Radu took a half a minute, but eventually, to his great relief, he got to go too. And they had to make contact with her one by one to go through it, apparently because of the fact that you had to have a representative of each sex. And also, all of these were scheduled ahead of time. So the wise, and when she looked into Cesar's eyes the first time, she was very tickled and said that it's a privilege to meet someone who knows the wise men. And they were about to meet one of these wise men, which is the guardian of Shambhala. And it's another very short-lived trip. but they saw it was inside of a mountain, and it overlooked a large and lush forest, and they could see some other mountains in the distance, and also a house where you could rest, and also dinosaurs and iguanas. And the dinosaurs there are smaller and not aggressive. And in this case, it was a pterodactyl. And also, this interior of the mountain was very delicately carved there, and it had very large pillars and inscriptions that were based on dots and lines, and more tunnels but they were symmetrical and very neat on either side of them. And they couldn't explore them, unfortunately. They were just met by this guardian who was also very tall, and he just tell them this and that, but essentially gave Radu more initiation and instruction for his last, at least in this book, trips into Hollow Earth, which was a unique way of accessing, and it was going to take place in Patagonia. And also, the telepathy inside Hollow Earth isn't limited to voice, although he would hear it, and apparently it would be Romanian, but it also included pictures. And one of these pictures was that of a very dry land in Patagonia, where he was supposed to meet this shaman. And then that's what they followed his instructions and flew there. And even they didn't even have GPS, but luckily they had phones with GPS and could find it. And this was a couple of weeks later. And they were greeted by the shaman, who was very taciturn and mysterious and didn't answer in English, but luckily Radu knew Spanish and could ask him if he was the guy that was waiting for them. And he told them to follow him, and they went deeper into those mountains and out of a cave. And there was no danger of, although he was pretty specific of the location, there was no danger of disclosing this information on Radu's part, because it would have to be a two-way street. I mean, you can't just go there and expect for the portal to appear, because you have to be met halfway by the representatives of Hollow Earth, and they have to want you there, like in your case. So, and they got met with a couple, men and women, and they were in front of this opening in the mountain. And this, when they entered it, you could see the end of it, but when they traversed it, the walls around them morphed to match the interior of the earth, but in an accelerated way. So I guess the wise man, the guardian, wanted him to experience all these different entryways. And it was kind of reminiscent of how they went to Tibet in the second book. And he could see the formations. First of all, there was water, streams of it, and then there were pools of lava, and eventually there were very large crystals, and they were up to 1 meter long. And at the end, they saw a door that was slightly arched, and they went through it and got teleported, I guess, or directly into their house. And from the first glance, he could see that it was quite unlike what he was used to. So his first impression was seeing a few chairs that he thought were kind of old school, but when he looked a little deeper, he just focused on the place that he wanted, and then they changed to more elegant style. And that is a common feature in Hollow Earth, that the perception is down to you, and the more detailed gaze you give something, the more refined it's going to turn out. And also, he got showed different technology there. For example, so the outline of the house wasn't that unlike what we have in terms of purpose, but he could see something that we would associate with a kitchen, and that they had larger fruit in their he even was offered this apple that was much bigger, the size of a cantaloupe, and then he didn't eat it, but he noticed that when he would look at something that wasn't quite clear to him, it was blurry, he got read telepathically by his liaison there, and he told him that the reason for that is that his consciousness is just not ready to see it. So it's just like a dog seeing one of our devices. But the minute he told him what that represented, which was a kind of juicer for that apple and other fruit, but one that only extracts the essence, the finest essence of it, and that's just one of their sources of food. But then he saw it much clearer. And they also had a sort of fridge, but it wasn't a fridge because they went out their way to not dehydrate or change the temperature of their stored food. They only encased each item in a sort of film, and that would ensure that it didn't age. And also, he saw that the windows and the doors seemed open, seemed like they didn't have any at all. But when he got out of the house, he saw that they were there, or at least you could say it was a cloaking tech, like in the Butch Age. But it was more than just visual, because apparently they preserved the temperature because the outside was a little cooler than the inside. And if they wanted to rest, because obviously it's hollow earth, and as I said, the sun is still powerful and it shines vertically and all the time. And if you want to rest or sleep, you have the option to put the blinds on the windows. So then he gets a ride around town, and it was very early in the morning. That's why there were very few people on the street, and they got talking to this couple, and apparently they were pre-Mayan. They were the progeny of the Olmecs and Toltecs, who initially only had this very scattered hamlet, but in time it grew into the city that it is today. But it still had very archaic architecture, very neat and very clean, obviously. And he noticed a medallion on the lady that didn't even have a chain. It just stuck to her chest, and it represented a coat of arms that was tied to her lineage. And apparently the frequency of it, because it matched her, it didn't even need the support. And then he he noticed other things that he disassociated from, because his understanding wasn't quite up to snuff. But for example, this town neighbored Shambhala, to Radu's delight, and he could see a much clearer vantage point now, and he could only see the first layer of it. And even people from that town, although they lived fully in the etheric realm, even they didn't have access to the inner rings, except for some of them. And it was a matter of evolving spiritually to get to that point. And that's the whole purpose of Shambhala, actually. He also noticed while walking that there was an ocean, and they actually called it as such, but the waves were very low and it was very peaceful. But there wasn't just the fact that it was hollow earth, there was also the fact that it was a gulf there. And he saw some ships, and there were many shapes and sizes, but he mentioned some tubular ones, cylindrical, that came from out of a kind of vortex or funnel high in the sky. And this got him talking to the Native American, and who was a full-time guide. This was his job, but he didn't call it a job to initiate people to Hollow Earth, because apparently there is no pressure to have a job. It's just what you choose to do, and you just do what's right, generally. And these ships, apparently, that funnel is what it looks like when you enter with a ship through the South Pole, and that's just the manifestation that you see it as. And this got him to the conclusion that they were near the South Pole there. And finally, they returned to the house, and one of the things that he disassociated from was a shelf of books but because he inquired about it, the lady, the Native American, made a gesture with her hand, and then he could see it. And he grabbed a few of them one by one, and he was even more impressed by the way he could glean information from them than from the very advanced holographic devices from Buttigieg, because they gave him direct cognition of the information there, not just in words, but also visually. And they even had relief inscriptions that allowed you, symbols that allowed you to explore in depth. And apparently it had the characteristics of a disc holder case. So it had very thick pages, and each page represented a certain theme. Like in the case of the history book that he picked up, it was a page represented roughly 100 years of history. And then that's how he found out some more about their history there. But and also there was one on medicine and others, but he was really impressed by this technology, which is no doubt limited to the etheric plane, because I also found this in another contactee account, and it was very, very similar, and it was also on the higher dimensional, higher density ships. So I doubt that you could have access to this on the surface, but it was only left to your dexterity, and he couldn't unfortunately get to explore too much, but he was convinced that in time he could maneuver them much more efficiently than he had then. Anyway, that was pretty much the end of the fifth book.
So
And
why don't we combine books 6 and 7 together in the next part 3, because we've done 2 hours already.
you're right. Yeah, it's pretty late here, but I just hope that I asked you, I involved you enough, because you have really cool insights. And in the case of the last third, like the Hollow Earth trip, I kind of was, careless about asking you questions.
Well, what I noticed was very interesting about the Telosian city is that they grow their own food. They have layers of how they grow their plant food. So, and how they grow their protein food and enzyme food. So they are not dependent on doing trade with the surface for food. They are completely able to grow their own food. So there's no dependence on the surface world for food. They can grow anything they want, and they can simulate the growing cycles based on the energy, changing the energy frequency. So they have the capability to grow their own food however they want energetically, and they add crystal essences to the food to make it stronger and more vibrant and lush. So they used a lot of citrine, they used a lot of amethyst, rose quartz, clear quartz. It became part of the water, the nutrients in their gardening and in their food growth as well. So that's something special that I had noticed when I was there.
Right. And I did want to maybe ask you if you witnessed some kind of technology that we would, interpret as etheric, such as the one that he saw there that extracted the essence of that fruit, or stuff that he couldn't see at first, like the way that preserved food, or like the windows, if you saw that similar type of phenomenon there.
Well, I didn't see any soil when they were growing the plants. So it was just the water, and it was just the crystalline essences, and it shimmered. So they don't need soil to grow food. It's like hydroponics mixed with crystalline essences. And it's all really like the food is stored in high vibrational energetic storage containment rooms or something like that. So there's nothing like fridges or blenders. It's stored in these, the frequency of the energy is always balanced. There's no cold or hot spaces in telos where the food is stored. And it's stored by categories and is well organized. Everything is very well organized. So they have their own storage units for everything they need food-wise. Every house has this storage area where the temperature is exact. It's perfect. It's so balanced. There's no variation between cold or hot. It's just balanced perfectly for the food. So that's something special and unique about Telos, I think.
Yeah. And if I may just close this with the fact that there are also apparently seasons in Hollow Earth, because there are two of them. And that's because of how the sun shines on each pole for a long time. And that reflects on there too, but mainly it's on closer to the pole. In the region of the equator, it's more or less the same year round. And also he got showed a section of the Earth that revealed that in the very center there is a spirit of the planet, which is actually masculine, and this, you could say, the soul, or the living part of it is feminine, like we know about Gaia, but the spirit is actually male, and that's because of how the will of it, also you could call it, the one that's responsible for the implementation of all this material, that every part of it and the size of it and its destiny and all that is guided through this. And it's masculine because he noticed that he had a great strength and sense of dignity. That's just how it's said. But it's important that there is interplay between them. So Gaia, or the soul, is feminine, and yeah, you can tell there are signs of that, and you can't have one without the other. So that was just and also that all these peoples live in symbiosis. There is no war really, because it's certainly, take in Earth for example, it would be very easy to make them collapse. So it's a very tight balance. They always have to look out to just to survive. I mean, they do it and they thrive, but that's the explanation for why they don't allow nearly anyone from the surface. And yeah, he got showed this in an intuitive device, a Akashic field tapping device that was able to show him the section, because you wouldn't obviously be able to section the Earth through our primitive devices.
So Radu was shown this, yes?
Of course, yes.
When I was in Telos, the energies were perfectly balanced, 50% masculine, 50% feminine, perfect yin-yang balance between the men and the women, and everybody's treated equally. So again, 50% masculine, 50% feminine. So perfect balance between the yin and the yang. Nobody is greater than anybody else. Nobody is less than anybody else. They all could do whatever jobs they wanted to. Grow food, take care of the crystals, work in the library, and they could switch jobs if they wanted to find out what it was like. They could apprentice. There's no money system. You can try whatever job field you want to see if you like it or not. And if it's the job for you, then you can do it on a more permanent basis instead of rotating. So the way that they try their job stuff is more wisdom based. It's not considered a job. It's considered something that the soul would like to do, in terms of, because they're not lazy down there. They're very productive. They're highly productive. They're wisdom based folks in Telos. And they teach by example and by wisdom. You try what you want to see if you like it or not. You don't have to do an interview. You don't have to test for anything. It's so hard on the surface of this planet to get certain types of jobs. You go for an interview, go for a test. If you're told you're not qualified, you don't get the job. In Telos, they're not told you're not qualified. Go try it, see if you like it. Do an internship in that work field. And if you like it, you can stay and do more of it. If you don't, you can try something else. They learn by interning. They learn by example from their elders. And the elders are very patient, very patient. There's no such thing as right or wrong. If you made a mistake, that's not considered a mistake. It's considered a learning point that you learn more from, and you get to experience every aspect of what you're trying out. So there's no judgment. There's no, oh my God, you didn't pass the interview, you didn't pass the test, you don't get to try the job. There's no such barriers in Telos. You get to try whatever work you want. Because if that's what you're passionate with your soul frequency and you're good at it, you can stay in it. If not, then you can rotate and try something else until you find what you like to do. That's how their system of wisdom growing works. That's something else that I found special there.
Yeah, that's extremely consistent with the books, also their philosophies. I'm sure these inner earth peoples, they've been there for thousands of years and they must communicate, but still they always, even under Romania, they each have their distinct, characters. But just last thing that I forgot to mention is that he also during this section he saw ET bases that were obscured by a sphere, and it would be interesting to know if what types of ETs are down there. But yeah, apparently it was too sensitive.
From when I visited in Telos, I could see cigar-shaped craft flying above the city and saucer-shaped craft. Sometimes the Arcturians visit, the Pleiadians, the Andromedans. They're allowed to go into inner Earth, other positive ET species. The Telosians are allied with the Arcturians, Pleiadians, and the Andromedans from what I could see. And I saw different ship types come and go. Above, not down low where the city is, but above, much higher. There is a sky, again, there is sun, there's lakes, there's water, it's a whole ecosystem. It's a very large city. So I did see evidence of extraterrestrial crafts coming and going. And again, I would wear either white or blue robes. And on my website, when people visit it, you see a woman with a white robe, and there's a saucer craft behind her, because that's what I got to see when I was in Telos. So that's why that's on my website. And it's a woman with brown hair, because when I went in there, I had more brown hair instead of blonde at that time. So that image is a representation of what I looked like at the time. So there are extraterrestrials visiting and interacting with the Argarthans, or inner Earth people.
Actually, Agartha is the name that Penny Bradley mentioned that she got taught in school. That also, my last question is, just to be clear, is Telos under Mount Shasta, and is it an inner Earth place or is it in Hollow Earth?
What's the difference to you?
Well, the difference is that in Hollow Earth, you always see the sun, and it's very comparable to the surface in the sense you also see sky, and it's also bluish. And you would maybe expect to see the other sides of the Earth, but no, apparently it's a sky. And in inner Earth, you do get sources of light, and I forgot to mention that the Apelos have a very advanced crystal technology that also infuses them with high frequencies that are very different, so that also accounts for the photosynthesis there. But when you're in inner Earth, you always see the limitations, which are the rocks around you. So that's why I was curious what Telos was like.
Well, there's a lot of cavern systems, and then the city is above the cavern systems, and you see the sky, you see the sun, you see a lot of parks, oceans, lakes. So I'm not quite sure. It's probably somewhere between Hollow Earth and inner Earth. I would say it's somewhere in the middle. It is under Mount Shasta, but it's really deep under Mount Shasta. So I think it's between Hollow Earth and inner Earth, somewhere in between the two. It's not one or the other, it's between the two. Yeah,
I have no doubt that it's there as well, because there are many accounts that are very believable. One in particular, but yeah, I didn't know you had so many memories. So definitely looking forward to that book.
Yeah, I have a lot of different experiences. So I was just and actually my I called it just the inner Earth experience, and it's in the presentation. So that's going to be, it's a very early presentation that I had made. I was invited to a council meeting to discuss the reptilians, the threat of the reptilians, and how the plasma cannons were illegal, that Telosians don't approve of that, and that's illegal in space to use them because they're planetary destroyers. So I sat in one of their 100 councils, and different representatives wore different kinds of robes, and they came from different planets. Even they were discussing the ancient elders, the 13 elders. They were in the middle of the citadel. They had the floor speaking. We were all listening, and they were discussing the reptilian threat and stuff like that. That was a council meeting, and somewhere even outside of Telos, but we had to go through a Telosian portal to get to the council meeting. It was very interesting. So I've had several trips to Inner Earth, Hollow Earth, to discuss these things. One of the council meetings was again about the reptilians and making sure to protect the cloaked planets, that nothing would be decloaked, and that these planets would get representation and protection.
Yeah, we'll definitely cover the reptilians in the upcoming book, which, by the way, 6 and 7 are my favorite by a landslide, and their rate gets really, really good. And they also agree with you that about, you know, how there's the reptilian threat, and that it gives a lot of corroboration to your account in general. And yeah, it deals with the history of humanity and also Atlantis, and there are more parallels that I can keep up with, and with the pyramids of Egypt and all crystalline technology and all sorts of stuff.
Wonderful. So we'll cover those subjects in books 6 and 7 in our part 3. So stay tuned, everyone. And thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom.
My pleasure.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.